So where you can turn to Matthew. I will be generally there because I am resuming the Matthew series. We're good, Jared? Okay. Great. I'm going to go ahead and pray for our time in the Word here, and then we'll get moving. I'll go ahead and pray. Father, your word is valuable, we know, and we ask you help us to treat it accordingly. Me especially, as I'm up here teaching it, but also all your people. Let us open our hearts to your word and hear it. And this message today is more review than anything, but I ask that it put your people in remembrance of things, and that even this would be helpful for them as they go out into the rest of this week. And I ask it in your Son's name, the name of Jesus. Amen. So I said that today we'd be resuming my Matthew series, which has been on the shelf for several months, doing the legalism study that we were doing. So we are back in Matthew. Now, as is typical when I resume this series after a break, I do like to spend a whole message just discussing Matthew's outline and where we are in it, just as kind of a refresher, also to get you reoriented, so that we don't just jump back in and you wonder, what are we doing in this part of Matthew? So that's what I'm doing today. It's going to be one of those kind of outlining messages in which we revisit a lot of stuff and then try to get an idea of the way forward. So really there are three goals overall today in this message and 3 points of my outline. First, I just want to summarize the 4 sections of Matthew that we have already seen, including the one that we're currently studying, where we are now. So a lot of that is just going to be, sort of hitting the mountaintops of the first part of Matthew's gospel that we've already studied. And then secondly, I want to describe what we've seen so far in this 4th section of Matthew that we've been studying, which specifically, the part we've seen has been those parables. The parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom, as I called them. So I want to review our stuff from that just to make sure it's fresh in your mind, because it's very much part of what we're going to continue studying. And that's my 3rd point. I want to give a preview of the remainder of this 4th section of Matthew, as I have called it, just to tell you kind of ahead of time what to expect and get your mind going in the right direction, which I call this next phase of Matthew stories of disciples and doubters, just because it kind of summarizes everything you're going to see. So I want to hit those 3 things and just kind of give you an idea of where we've been and where we're going. Very typical for when I resume this series after a break. Now, the point of such messages as this, other than just getting you reoriented into Matthew's outline, is to make sure that we're reading Scripture correctly, that we're actually approaching the Bible with the right frame of mind. Most Christians tend to read the Bible as a collection of randomly arranged stories and commands that were just kind of thrown together as whoever was writing that particular book saw fit. And that's kind of how a lot of Christians read them. It's really not faithful to the nature of Scripture to read it that way, however, because the Bible is much more than that. And of course, I'm assuming that it's unhelpful to read the Bible in any way that is contrary to its own nature. So I very much resist that kind of anthology approach to reading the Bible, which is how a lot of people read it. The Bible really is literature. When you think about it, it is written documents. It's a lot more than just literature like you would study in school or read for fun, but it is not less than literature. It operates according to the same basic principles of written word. So every document, when you think about it from that perspective, every document you read, every writing, has its own structure, has its own topics, has its own goals. The author of those works, they're trying to do something. They want you to read this thing that they've written and walk away and do something or think something. And that's pretty much how it goes. And to understand what they've written, you have to understand that structure, understand those topics, understand those goals. Otherwise, you're fundamentally going to misunderstand what they're doing. The same is true of biblical books. I mean, these authors, very much had, in their own way, burdens from God or things from God to tell people. and they're trying to work those things out as they write these documents. So as we approach them, we have to approach them in that mindset. So I continually come back to Matthew's outline and his purposes so that we can read his book correctly. I don't want you to detach anything, from the overall skeleton that Matthew has as he goes throughout his book here. So that's why I keep coming back to all this. It's just to make sure that we're reading the Bible and this particular book of the Bible properly. Now, on that note, it'd be fair to remind you of my views on Matthew's purpose, what I think Matthew is trying to do, just based on my own study of the book and things I've told you so far, things I will tell you. Matthew's purpose, I have said from the beginning that I think Matthew has written his gospel for one chief purpose, and that is to evangelize and disciple his own people, that is the Jews of Palestine, the land of the Jews. I think he's very much writing for his own group of people over there at that time. I say Palestinian to indicate the Jews that lived, in Palestine. They're the most Jewish of the Jews, you might say. Now, I'm pretty sure Matthew's gospel would have value for Jews living elsewhere, and even for people who are not Jews. I mean, after all, we're studying it. I'm not trying to limit it, saying it's only useful for them. I'm just saying that as he set about to relate the stories of Jesus and his teachings, I think his chief burden was for his own people, trying to evangelize them and disciple them. Now, I've said that for maybe two reasons. One is just that there are certain distinctive details of Matthew that I think fit best with the Palestinian Jewish context. If you're over there, in ancient Palestine, the land of the Jews, certain things about Matthew's gospel make a little more sense to you. So that's kind of a factor in my decision that that's what Matthew's trying to do. The other thing, however, is Matthew's outline. I feel as we unfold what he's writing, it tends to fall into place better if you're thinking from that kind of ultra-Jewish context. So all of that is my reason for saying Matthew's purpose is specifically the evangelizing and discipling of his own people. Which brings me back to the main idea for this message, talking about Matthew's outline and trying to see how Matthew has been, working out that purpose throughout his gospel. So let's go ahead and go to point 1 here. This is again just summarizing the 4 sections of Matthew that we've already studied, including the one that we're kind of in the middle of studying, section 4, and just giving a very bullet point review of what we've seen so far. And I'll indicate how each one of these sections has so far advanced Matthew's purpose, show you how it ties into what he's doing as he addresses these things to his own people. So the first section, section 1 of Matthew, I give these all a bit of titles, sort of a sentence that summarizes the section. And this section summary is, Jesus is the Messiah. A good place to begin for a gospel. That's section 1 of Matthew. Now, I identify that first section as going from the beginning of the book until you get to chapter 4, verse 22. That's sort of where I cut it off. A lot of these sections tend to phase into each other. There's kind of an overlap. But my cutoff point generally for this first section, I said, was verse 22 of chapter 4. I'll go ahead and read where that is. Actually, verses 18 through 22, just to give you the whole story that's there. This I consider to be the end of that first section. It says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. So that and everything before it, I think, is pretty much the first section of Matthew. Now, this first section largely is introductory information to the life of Jesus, kind of giving you an idea, who is this Jesus guy, what's he doing, what's he all about. That's generally what you have in this first part of Matthew. You begin with his genealogy. Matthew gives you that nice, organized, very Jewish genealogy of Jesus. You meet his parents. You meet Mary, you meet Joseph, who was assumed to be his father, even though God was his father. You see some events from his infancy. like Herod's attempt to stamp out Jesus there at the very beginning and all that. We see at the end of this first section, you see the beginning of his ministry, like the calling of the first disciples there. You see all that kind of stuff, and it's all very introductory information, gives you an idea of what Jesus is like and what kinds of things he does. But Matthew has a greater purpose for that first section. He intends it very much to be evidence that Jesus is the Messiah. This is sort of argument one for Matthew as he addresses his own people, trying to evangelize them, convince them of the gospel, that Jesus is the king they have been waiting for, descended from the line of David, who is to be the great king, ruler of heaven and earth. Now, for the most part, as Matthew goes through this first section, giving you sort of these introductory points into Jesus' life, he shows you how Jesus, in a large way, fulfills Old Testament expectation for the Messiah. Sometimes that is through quoting Scripture and showing you how it lines up with something Jesus did. Sometimes it's showing you just how much Jesus falls in line with other expectations, or showing you how Jesus follows in the footsteps of other Old Testament events, showing you that he's very much moving in this idea of God's plan for the world. He does it in various ways, but that's generally the argument. If we approach this first section from a very Jewish perspective, we will see very clearly how Matthew is using these early events in the life of Jesus as an appeal, as an argument for his own people to believe that this man truly is their Messiah, is the Christ. Now, if you wanted to evangelize an audience of Palestinian Jews, some section like that would be necessary. I mean, you're not getting anywhere unless you show how this guy Jesus fulfills all these expectations I've been having for the Messiah. Falls in line with Old Testament prophecy and promise regarding the Christ. So Matthew had to do that at some point, and he just does it right here at the beginning to give you his opening salvo of arguments that Jesus is the Messiah. That's his first section. Which brings us along to the second section, which I sometimes have jokingly referred to as Matthew's self-refutation, because it kind of goes the opposite direction. I summarize Matthew's second section as Jesus confronts Israel with a ministry of teaching, evangelism, and healing. And that section covers where we left off. You have the calling of the first disciples there in chapter 4, and it goes to about chapter 9, verse 35. Again, there's some kind of overlap that Matthew likes to do, but generally that's where I cut it off. Now, if you're wondering what is there, it's very simple. The first part of that is the Sermon on the Mount. You have about 3 chapters of Jesus just teaching, just recorded there, kind of the lengthiest sermon we have from him, really, I think. And then finally, you have 2 chapters other than that, after that, chapters 8 and 9, basically, where you get various miracle stories. So that's basically what's there, but when you start putting all that together and thinking, okay, what's going on here, I really do think this summary statement that I give is accurate, that Jesus is confronting Israel with this ministry of teaching, evangelism, and healing. Now, that teaching, evangelism, and healing part of it, I'm getting that straight from Matthew's own summaries of this section at the very beginning of this section and at the very end of it, because he tells you exactly what Jesus is up to. Chapter 4, verse 23, you see this. And he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel, so there's the evangelism, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. And then we come back in chapter 9, verse 35, to this roughly the end point of this section, and Matthew says nearly the same thing again. 9:35, he says, Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction. It's kind of like bookends. Beginning, end of this second section. What's Jesus doing? He's teaching, he's evangelizing, and he's healing. So that's what Jesus is up to. In that sense, Matthew is very explicit. Now, the rest of this here, this idea of confrontation, I get that because, once again, if you kind of assume the typical ancient Jewish perspective on a lot of things, your practices, your beliefs, a lot of what Jesus says in this second section here, a lot of what he says, a lot of what he does is very confrontational. I mean, you as a good synagogue attending Jew would never say or do a lot of the things you see Jesus saying or doing. I mean, it's very radical compared to the things that you've experienced just growing up as a good synagogue attending Jew, which is why I say it's confrontational. Jesus is very much confronting Israel with his ministry of teaching, evangelism, and healing. So that's why I summarize the second section the way I do. Again, it's kind of the opposite of section 1. I mean, in section 1, you get all these arguments that Jesus is the Messiah. In section 2, it's like, whoa, Jesus is not the Messiah I expected in a lot of ways. So it's kind of a counterbalance, what Matthew does here in his first 2 sections. So how does the third section keep this going and deal with this kind of counterbalance? Well, Matthew's third section, as I understand it, I gave it this summary, that Jesus is rejected and responds to that rejection. Very much a rejection theme going throughout here. And again, that picks up where we left off with that summary statement there in chapter 9, and goes to throughout pretty much all of chapter 12. I think 12:50 is where I ended that one. Again, more of that sort of shading that Matthew likes to do, interweaving his section breaks. But basically what you have more bookends here. You have the section kind of beginning with an exorcism and ending with a very similar exorcism. Chapter 9, verse 32, I think, through 35. You kind of have this statement here, very small. As they were going away, behold, a demon-oppressed man who was mute was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, the mute man spoke, and the crowds marveled, saying, never was anything like this seen in Israel. But the Pharisees said, he casts out demons by the prince of demons. And then you have the summary statement, and Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction. There's kind of the overlap there where he kind of crosses the borders of his sections. But you come back to a very similar exorcism in chapter 12, which is again why I treat this as kind of like a bookend. You go to chapter 12, verse 22, you see something very similar. Then a demon-oppressed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, and he healed him so that the man spoke and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, can this be the son of David? But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, it is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons. Very similar wording. It's almost like Matthew again kind of giving you his breaks in his sections. Now, of course, that exorcism there at the end of chapter 12 spawns a whole controversy. So, you finish chapter 12 talking about all of that. But generally, that is section 3, as I understand it. Now, notable events of this section. What happens between this one exorcism and this other exorcism? Well, several things. First, we see Jesus give a sermon to his disciples. Just for the 12, not for the crowds, just for those 12. And the overriding theme of that sermon is that they will face persecution because of him. That's what he's telling them. Like, it's going to get hard. You're going to be going around teaching, and people aren't going to like you. Some terrible things are going to happen. After that, we see that John the Baptist, the Messiah's personal prophet, his forerunner, even he has some doubts about who Jesus is and what he's doing. He sends his disciples to Jesus to ask some questions, and Jesus answered those things. But you see this doubt that even John the Baptist has about him. After that, Jesus gives a very scathing rebuke to his own generation, and even citing specific cities where he has been, and he pronounces these woes against them because of their unbelief, because he's done all these miracles in them, and yet they have not believed in him. After that, you start to see the Pharisees begin to take their very active, hostile role toward Jesus. We think about the Pharisees as being sort of the stock opponents of Jesus. Really, that gets started here in this third section. And you see him contending with them over everything from Sabbath law to his exorcisms and everything in between. So those are the notable events of this section. Now, what is the common theme of all that? What has Matthew grouped together there in this third section? Well, really, there are 2 themes going throughout it. One, Matthew shows how the generation of Jesus largely rejected him, that he's getting a lot of bad press, so to speak, and a lot of people, in spite of the shallow fascination of the crowds, that's pretty much as high as it goes. Otherwise, there's just not a lot of acceptance of him and what he's doing. But also, Matthew shows the reader how Jesus responds to all of that. Jesus doesn't take all that lying down. He actually has things to say about that. And Matthew kind of puts those two things together in this one section on this rejection theme. The section functions largely as a condemnation to the Jews who rejected Jesus while he was walking around Palestine. It's sort of like, here's how you guys treated Jesus, here's what he had to say about you, and that's largely what Matthew's doing here. Now, the condemnation here that Matthew provides would hopefully stir up a bit of repentance in his reader. You know, we're about a generation afterward here in the time of the Jews. Hopefully Matthew's readers will be reading this and thinking, man, I don't really want to be like them back then, so maybe I should give Jesus a little more thought and not just reject him out of hand as the earlier generation did. So you see that kind of idea of rejection, that Jesus is rejected, responds to that rejection. It's the dominant idea of that third section, as I understand it. Which brings us now to where we currently are in Matthew, the fourth section, which I have summarized as Jesus has disciples who believe the signs, while the opposition grows more stubborn. So you have kind of a return of balance here in the way people view Jesus. And I said this section goes from that part there in chapter 12 that I mentioned with that exorcism and all of its controversies, up to about the middle part of chapter 16, which is the very end of Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ, a very well-known passage. As with most of Matthew's sections, again, there's some overlap there between the beginning and ending of the prior section and what's eventually going to happen. Matthew likes to avoid these kind of hard transitions. He likes to kind of phase in and out. But again, I think generally speaking, that's where your fourth section begins and ends. And I say that once again because Matthew provides this kind of bookend, or the inclusio as I've often called it, where he gives you sort of similar stories or statements that shows you that he's beginning and ending a section. Go to Matthew 12 here. I'll read you the beginning of this. You have verse 38 in the middle of this controversy over that exorcism. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." Well, that's not the last time you see that kind of altercation. You go to chapter 16, the very first story there, verses 1 through 4. "And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to test him, and they asked him to show a sign from heaven. He answered them, 'When it is evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it'll be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah.' So he left them and departed." So you see those stories that are being very similar, requests for a sign from the enemies of Jesus, and he just refuses to indulge them in their request all out. So very similar, they form again kind of like a bookend. Now chapter 16 there goes on for a little bit. I think there's a little bit more to say that can be grouped with that fourth section. But generally Matthew provides you with those markers that he likes to give, showing you where he is kind of beginning and ending his current thought process and what he's trying to do in this part of his gospel. Now, very much like the second section, this fourth section has sort of two main divisions. It begins largely with those parables. I mentioned that the first half is the parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom, which we've studied already. We went through all that, then we took our break to do the legalism series. The second half of this fourth section, however, is where we're going, which I call stories of disciples and doubters, because it is a bunch of stories about disciples and doubters that Jesus encounters in his ministry. So you have the first half, Jesus is telling stories about the kingdom, whereas in the second half, Matthew is telling stories about Jesus and some of these people that he encounters. But all of that is the fourth section of Matthew. And I think they very much come down to this one united theme that kind of divides the audience here. Jesus has his disciples who believe his signs that he performs. Meanwhile, you have the opposition growing even more stubborn against Jesus. So getting even worse than they were back in the third section that was focusing on the rejection of Christ. And we'll see more of all that in a minute, but that is basically where we are in Matthew's Gospel. The fourth section, Jesus has disciples who believe the signs, while the opposition to him becomes even more stubborn. That is basically where we are right now in Matthew. So, what I want to do now, getting into my second big goal here for today, is I want to describe what we've seen so far in this fourth section, meaning the section on parables, the parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom. I want to review that, everything that we were talking about last time. It's because I do think these parables and everything that we'll study over the next several months, both past and future here, are really one section. So I want you to have what we've already done sort of fresh in your mind as we move forward because they are linked. I don't want you to separate them too greatly. I know that it's a very great difference between parables and all these stories about Jesus, and we did throw a huge break in the middle of it with my legalism study. But I don't want you to have that break so firmly fixed in your mind that it keeps you from linking them together. So I want to go ahead and do this review, get these parables and the lessons we learned from them back in your mind as we go on in this fourth section. So I'm going to do this by taking the summary message that I taught at the end of that parable section and just kind of giving you that in its very basic form to remind you of what we saw. And all of these points here are pretty much about the nature of disciples and discipleship. I mean, you really see in these parables what it means to be a disciple and how a disciple should think and act. So that's how they all go. So the first one of these is that the disciple understands the mysteries of the kingdom. That is our first point, and that comes up pretty early on in this parable section. Matthew 13, verses 10 through 13. The disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." So these parables, in these parables, Jesus gives knowledge to the disciples, but actually hides that knowledge from everyone else. One of the genius points of these parables of Jesus is that those who know the truth will hear these parables and recognize them as being illustrations of truth, whereas those who do not believe the truth and don't follow Jesus are just going to hear a bunch of stories about farmers and sowing seed and all that kind of stuff, which they're just going to say, well, I came all this way to hear this. This is the great Jesus I've heard about. And they're just going to be ignorant from that point on. So that's kind of the great genius point of these parables, that they hide truth and reveal truth at the same time. And yet the reason Jesus does that is because of the response he was already getting in his ministry. To him who has, more will be given. To him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. There were people like the disciples who were following Jesus, little as they understood, and to them Jesus gave more. There were those who were not fond of Jesus and were very much turning in rejection of the things he was saying and doing, and to them they're going to lose even what they had. Even what they thought they knew, they're going to lose now, because Jesus is going to make himself appear to be just kind of this weird storyteller with these parables. That's really what's going on here. The disciples, however, to focus on them, received what Jesus gave to them, and for that reason, he is going to give them more knowledge through these parables. Meanwhile, the opposition to Jesus, who did not receive what Jesus was saying, as a consequence, they're going to lose what knowledge they even had before. These parables are going to appear as nothing, and now Jesus will be even less in their eyes, even less worthy of listening to him. That is generally how it's going to go, and it's going to deepen this divide between the disciples and the opposition. The divide gets even more firm as we go through these parables. And it's going to keep going that way as we go through the rest of section 4. But it's very much starting here with these parables, where Jesus says, you're my disciples, you get the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. These people are not, and they don't get that. It's very much a firm divide. And I believe Matthew has portrayed it this way to provoke his readers to fear. He tells them this because he doesn't want them to be like the people who, again, when Jesus was around, were opposed to his message. He wants, I think, to scare them in a sense and make them think, hey, If you treat these things lightly, you might find yourself on the wrong end of the spectrum here among these people who lose even what they have. I think it's very much a warning. And the way Matthew ends it here, this last parable Jesus tells here in, let's see here, chapter 13, verse 51, he says to the disciples, "Have you understood all these things?" And they said to him, "Yes." And he said to them, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." So there you are. If you have understood these things, you have treasure. And if you don't understand these things, you're missing out on that treasure that Jesus is trying to give. I think that is Matthew's implicit warning to people not to treat these things lightly. So the disciple, first and foremost, he understands the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Now, among those mysteries, you have this point here, the second thing. The disciple understands the importance of the final judgment, of that day whenever God will actually gather all people and pass judgment on them. Now, I included this point because final judgment is mentioned often in the second half of this parable sermon that Jesus gives. It is a very common theme once you get to that last half. The parable of the weeds, right, describes the final judgment as a separating of the wheat from the weeds and the burning of the weeds, whereas the wheat gets gathered into barns. It's a very much a farm image, but very much a powerful image of the final judgment. And you get that image twice, actually, because Jesus comes back to that parable and interprets it for his disciples to make sure they understand what it's talking about. So you get kind of a second round of this judgment image. And then the third thing is you get the parable of the net, with the fishermen gathering up all the fish and the fishermen dividing them out. Well, again, you have this image of how the nations are going to be separated out like fish from a fisherman's net in the final judgment. So Jesus really wants his disciples to understand the importance of the final judgment. Otherwise, why would he keep coming back to the idea in the last half of this parable series that he gives? Well, the final judgment is important, but why? Okay, so why is that? Well, I determined, and I told you this back then, that it is important to a disciple because it provides hope. It is actually a very hopeful thing for a disciple that God is eventually going to judge the nations. Because as a disciple of Jesus, you are bound to endure much from the world. I mean, this world is not your home, and it very much treats you with hostility. It is good to know, and it is easier to endure all that when you know that God will not only end it all, but also right every wrong. That there is a time when those that have afflicted the truth and those that have opposed the believers will actually get justice. And there is a time when even your hard efforts will be rewarded there at the end when Christ brings his reward with him when he returns. It is a hopeful thing. It is a very grave topic, certainly not a cheerful one, but it is the hope of the disciple that someday all these things that we experience will be set right. Now, of course, all this focus on separating the righteous from the wicked is a good way to begin the section 4 of Matthew, because again, in Matthew's section 4, we have this growing divide between the disciples who believe the signs of Jesus and the opposition that grows more stubborn. Well, here we have this indication in all these parables about the final judgment that someday that divide is going to be ultimate and irreversible. That at some point, God is going to draw a line and everyone's going to be on one side of that line or the other. And where you fall on that depends on what you do now. Whether you choose to be a disciple who believes the signs or whether you choose to oppose the teaching of Jesus and the things he's saying and doing. This, of course, again, is very much a warning, very much an evangelistic warning, trying to get his readers to see the severity of all this and just how important it is. And so I think Matthew is trying to portray God with his teeth here, saying that yes, God is a God who punishes sin eventually, and now is the time to make sure you fall on the right side of the line. So I think that's very much what he's doing here, but also very important for the disciple to understand final judgment, because again, it is very much a hopeful thing for a disciple, that God does eventually judge the earth. Okay, third thing. The disciple understands patience and sacrifice in the context of the final judgment. This is worthy of a summary mention because these ideas actually have a way of intruding themselves into this last half of the parable sermon that Jesus gives. He's talking primarily about the final judgment, but he throws in these other ideas as well. We see these two parables here, rather these two pairs of parables actually. The first, you have the mustard seed and the leaven, right? Chapter 13, verse 31. He says, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. And he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till all was leavened. And then you eventually have this other pair of parables here, again very similar to each other. Starting in verse 44, you have the hidden treasure and the pearl of great value. You say the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has to buy the field. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. You have these two pairs of parables that kind of force their way in here amid all this other teaching on the final judgment. And my point was, since they are put here in the middle of all this stuff about the final judgment, we should understand them together with the final judgment, not forgetting the context in which these things appear. And in working with that, I told you that this first set of parables really does stress the patience of the disciple who has to wait for the kingdom to reach its full greatness. Waiting for the mustard seed to grow into that great tree. Waiting for that leaven to get disseminated throughout the entire loaf. You have to wait for that. It requires patience. And of course, you're able to have that patience because in the end, there is this judgment where everything is set right. You can be patient here and wait for this because in the end, you're rewarded. And those that opposed you are dealt with truthfully and justly in the court of God's justice. Meanwhile, you have this other set of parables, the hidden treasure and the pearl of great value, which stress sacrifice. You're going to get this great treasure, but you got to give something else up first. You have to sacrifice for the kingdom. Being a disciple is a life of sacrifice. You have to give some things up to get this great treasure that is in store for you. And of course, once again, the final judgment helps you with that because you're able to do this knowing that in the end, God's going to rebalance the scales and it's going to be in your favor. Even if right now you have to lose things and get rid of things for the sake of Christ, in the end, you get so much more. And all that happens at the final judgment. So you're able to have this idea of patience and sacrifice because you know what's coming at the end of the age. Now, this rest of Matthew's 4th section that we're going to study, we're going to see powerful men become more and more opposed to Jesus, which of course is just going to increase throughout history. And you as the disciple, just as these disciples back then, need to have more of that patience and more of that sacrificial attitude that makes you able to give things up and sacrifice and be patient as you serve Christ. We're going to see the opposition to Jesus get slightly more intimidating as the section goes on. Surely that was intimidating for his disciples. To this day it is that way. The 4th section very much carries that theme forward, this need for patience and sacrifice in the life of a disciple. So again, the parables here very closely linked to what's coming next, even though there is very much a division there. So just to keep that in your mind. Final thing here on this parable section before we move on and I give you a heads up on what's coming in the Matthew study. The disciple understands the kingdom as the fulfillment of God's past actions. There is very much this idea of reaching back to the Old Testament and showing you how this kingdom that Jesus is speaking about is very much in line with all of that God was talking about back in the Old Testament. Matthew includes in this parable sermon here 2 Old Testament quotations, one in each half of the parable sermon actually, so he tries to balance it. The first quotation is from Isaiah, verses 14 through 15. You see this, indeed in their case, that is these people that see and do not see, hear but do not hear, and do not understand. He says, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, "You will indeed hear but never understand. You will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them." So you have that quotation there. Matthew says that it's fulfilled by what Jesus is doing. And you also have this second quotation later on from Psalm 78, which is one of these Psalms of Asaph. In verse 35, you see this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. "I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world." Both of those passages were somewhat challenging because they're very much described as prophecies being fulfilled. And yet when we went back there and studied them, we saw that Isaiah was talking about stuff happening in his own day, and Asaph was talking about what he was about to do in that psalm he was writing. So it's like, how does Jesus fulfill these things if there were things happening back then? Well, Matthew puts forward this idea, I think, to show that the things happening in the time of Jesus are just like things happening back in the day in the Old Testament, to show you that Jesus is, again, in line with everything that God has already done. From the Isaiah quotation, we learn that people have always been largely ignorant of what God is doing. You can send a prophet there to preach all you want. They're going to be blind. They're going to be deaf. They're not going to understand. That's what Isaiah faced. To some degree, he even caused that, if you go back and read his book. Well, in the same way, you have Jesus. Right now, people don't get Jesus. They don't understand him. They're not following him. What else is new? That's the typical treatment for a prophet. I mean, it happened to Isaiah. It's happening to Jesus now. He has fulfilled these things, and he has carried them through further in God's plan, and probably is going to endure them worse than any prophet ever had before. So you have that idea. But also you have this psalm from Asaph, in which he says he's going to speak to you in parables and other things that have been hidden. Okay, well, Jesus is here telling parables. Parables are hard to understand. Even the disciples need a little bit of help. Is that so strange? I mean, you see this guy Asaph back here in the Old Testament telling you that he's about to do the same thing. So truth has always been hard, right? You hear Jesus teaching, you say, "Oh, I don't get what he's saying. I don't get it." Well, again, what else is new? The Old Testament is like that. You go back there, men of God were doing that same thing. Jesus isn't any different. The only difference would be he's better at it. He's able to give these parables and teach truth to his disciples while perfectly hiding it from other people. So he's sort of the parable maestro here, but still very much in line with things that have been happening already in God's plan. So in both these ways, you see Jesus very much in line with what has been happening, and in some sense, these are signs. The parables, because they are so similar to things that God has done in the past, they show you that Jesus is operating within God's own framework. They are, in that sense, a sign to be believed or opposed, which again very much ties in with this overall theme of disciples believing the signs of Jesus, while the opposition just becomes more stubborn. But you see that the disciple here, one of the things he has to understand, and we see that from these parables here, is that he has to understand that the kingdom is very much the fulfillment of God's past actions. God was doing these things back then. He's carrying through that plan even now, even in these parables taught by Jesus. It's the same plan. It's a fulfillment in that sense. And that is everything we learned from the parable series when we were going through that, which is the first half of Matthew's fourth section. And now the question becomes, what are we going to see next as we go through the rest of this fourth section of Matthew? Well, here at the end of this message, I want to give you a heads up regarding what we're about to see, just kind of a review of what's coming in the next several months as I teach through all this. I summarize it as stories of disciples and doubters, because you see disciples and doubters show up at various points, and that pretty much characterizes the flavor of the rest of this section here. Now, the first thing I want to do is remind you of the importance of signs in this whole section. I have characterized all of section 4 with the title, Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. I'm very much trying to throw some emphasis on the signs of Jesus. And that is because I think it is warranted, Now, in the first part of this section, all you really have is the parables. And to some degree, they are a sign, like I said, but not a sign in the traditional sense of the term. We think of a sign as being something more like, a miracle or something. Well, in the rest of the fourth section, you're going to get some very extravagant signs of who Jesus is. We are going to see, first of all, maybe 4 great miracles that Jesus does. You have the 2 feeding miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. You also have walking on the water, one of Jesus' more well-known signs that he performs. Also, you have the healing of the Canaanite woman's daughter, one of the more perplexing miracles performed by Jesus. But all of them signs that Jesus does, all of which testifying to who he is and what he's doing. You also, however, have these summary statements given by Matthew that shows you just how much he's talking about these signs of Jesus. Just to give you 4 examples here. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 2. It says, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. And he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's kind of paranoid here. This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. And that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. What does it mean to hear about the fame of Jesus? You hear about his miraculous powers. Going further, verse 14. And when he went ashore, this is Jesus, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. So you have this mass healing of this giant crowd here. That's at the feeding of the 5,000, by the way. Also, you have later on in that same chapter, verse 34. And when he had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region, and brought him all who were sick, and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. So again, you have this healing of this whole region, over this whole region. People bring these people who are sick. Jesus heals them. So you have that kind of summary statement. And then there's another one in chapter 15, verse 29. Jesus went on from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he went up on the mountain and sat down there, and the great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put him at his feet, and he healed them. So again, these mass healings. Matthew is really pushing, whether it's these great extravagant signs of Jesus or these massive healing ministries that he's doing, he's really pushing the signs of Jesus in this section. And of course, he even began and ended this section with a request for a sign from the enemies of Jesus. So all of that together, the signs of Jesus play a huge role in this fourth section. Even one of these debates that he has with the Pharisees can in some sense be viewed as a sign. When he has this debate over tradition in chapter 15, he kind of gets into it with the Pharisees. One of the things he says is this. He says, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" He says, you Pharisees fulfill that perfectly. Even in that sense, even when Jesus is arguing with his enemies, even that is a kind of sign, because it shows that Jesus is right in line with these prophets, the prophets of old. I mean, Jesus isn't stepping out of line here. He's right in line with what God has done in the past. So all of this, you see these signs of Jesus, whether they're the miracles or the parables or these debates even. I mean, in some sense, sign is a huge factor in this fourth section. Now, in response to those signs, we're going to see the loyalty of Jesus' disciples. The disciples believed the signs, which is one half of my summary of this fourth section. The fourth section is truly unique in its focus on the disciples of Jesus. It's something that we haven't really seen yet in Matthew. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, in sections 1, 2, and 3, we've seen the disciples. They've been around. They've said some things. They've done some things. But it hasn't really been very major. They haven't really had a big role in Matthew's Gospel. Well, here in this fourth section, we're going to begin to see the kinds of things that we sort of expect about the disciples. I mean, we kind of have this image of what the disciples of Jesus were like as they were following him around. That image that you have in your head, I think largely comes from the fourth section of Matthew. I mean, we see the disciples doing the things that they typically do. I mean, we see them ask questions, not to test Jesus, but to learn things. Think of the disciples asking their questions. We see the disciples debate the meaning of what Jesus says about something. Not to just outright doubt it, but trying to figure out what did he mean when he said that. You see, that sort of thing. We even see the disciples making great confessions of faith. They worship him after he walks on the water. Peter makes his great confession that you are the Christ, Son of the living God. We associate all those things with the disciples. You really see those things here in this 4th section of Matthew. Now, we like to mock the disciples very often because of their lack of understanding. We like to give these guys a very hard time because of how dim-witted they were. But don't forget that in the middle of this nation that is largely not responsive to Jesus or has at best kind of a crowd enthusiasm response, these disciples are loyal. I mean, they're the ones that have left everything and followed him. What little they do understand about Jesus, they're believing and they're trusting. And even if they don't get it all yet, even if they don't fully understand it, these are the men that are the good guys. These are the good guys in Matthew's gospel along with Jesus. Don't forget that. For them, the signs all have meaning. They may not get it all, but it has meaning, and they're following it to the best of their ability. And we see that in the parable section. We see them, being the few that are entrusted with the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. But we see now that they're just continuing on in that vein. What little they had, they were given more, and now they're given more as they believe more. They keep following Jesus. We're going to see that throughout the rest of this 4th section. The loyalty of Jesus' disciples. It is there. However, it is also the counterpart to something else that is not so positive, and that is the opposition to Jesus. Which I've been saying is opposition that tends to grow more and more stubborn, and we will see that throughout the rest of this 4th section. This is the stories of disciples and doubters. This is the doubters part of things. As I said, we still have this focus on signs. You see at the very beginning and end of this section, the enemies of Jesus want to test him, saying, give us a sign from heaven. And, he very much rebukes them for their attitude. To the disciples, he'll give signs all day long. But to those who doubt him, to those who want to test him, no. An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. He's not going to have anything to do with it. But that is generally how his opponents respond. I mean, Jesus is doing these miracles. People, you can go anywhere in Palestine. You can hear, oh, Jesus healed my brother. My cousin was there when he fed the 5,000 people. Jesus has filled the country with signs. And yet the enemies of Jesus come to him and say, well, we want to see a sign from you. Now, these other signs, they don't count. We want to see a real sign from you. It's like, well, what more do you want? I mean, as I read, if even half these things Jesus does are true, that's pretty impressive. But then they come to him and say, well, we want to see another sign from you, a sign from heaven. That's how they are. I mean, you don't think that people could possibly get that thick-headed and that opposed to what Jesus is doing. But they do. I mean, a whole country full of miracles, and to them it means nothing. And you see that and that kind of attitude develop more and more throughout the rest of this 4th section. The disciples are increasing in understanding, showing more and more of their loyalty, understanding a little bit more bit by bit. Meanwhile, the enemies of Jesus just continue to harden their hearts. And you're going to see a lot of that throughout the rest of this 4th section, up through about half of chapter 16, where I'm drawing my line for the 4th section. Now, I want to briefly review here how the remainder of this 4th section is going to further Matthew's purposes. So why are we talking about all this? Why the signs? Why the loyalty of the disciples? Why all this opposition? Why talk about all this? What is this doing in Matthew's book as he writes to his own people, trying to evangelize them and disciple them? Well, first of all, Matthew's focus on the signs, I think, does further his evangelistic purposes. Matthew is giving Israel a second chance. The earlier generation who was around at the time of Jesus, they saw these signs, and to them, Jesus was at best just another healer that they ended up, wanting crucified. They blew their chance. Well, Matthew, as he relates all these other things that Jesus did, he's giving Israel a second chance to hear about these things, maybe to ask some of the old-timers about them, because we're only a generation later, and we're probably still there in Palestine, so people are around who saw Jesus. It gives them a chance to think about these things Jesus did and ask the question, Was he the Messiah? Did we kill our king? Is that what happened? It gives them a second chance. It's an evangelistic push in that direction. So Matthew's focus on signs very much furthers his evangelistic purposes. Also, secondly, Matthew presents a lot of teachings for the disciples. This is discipleship. This has value for discipling these people who get converted. Because Matthew doesn't want to just evangelize his own people. He wants to make disciples. He has that command from Jesus himself. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. Well, Matthew wants to do that, but to disciple people, you have to teach them something. You got to teach them. What does it mean to be a disciple? How does a follower of Jesus act? How does he think? Well, there are a lot of things here that are going to apply to that. We're going to learn a lot more about Jesus. As the disciples learn, as they get bit by bit more pieces of truth, we're going to get it too. And we're going to be discipled. And so was Matthew's audience when they first read this book. So it's very much a matter of discipleship value. But there's one final thing, and that is that the disciples have to learn about continued opposition to Jesus. Yes, we've been talking about this a lot in Matthew's gospel, but guess what? It's a big part of the Christian life, and Matthew wants his readers to know that opposition to Jesus continues, gets worse, doesn't end. That's part of the life of a disciple. Christians must always be reminded that they are the outsiders. We would love to believe that we can just kind of join in with the rest of the world and be like everyone else. That would be very comforting, but it is impossible because we're not like them. We're aiming toward a different goal. We serve a different Lord, and everything about us is the kind of thing that makes the world very, very angry, and it's going to lead to that kind of opposition. Probably all the more so, I would say, in a nation where Jesus was actually killed. I mean, imagine being Matthew writing this gospel to his own people, the people that killed their Messiah, and saying, here's what life's going to be like. You have these people that are opposed to Jesus. You think they're going to treat you any differently? Probably all the more so for them, for Matthew's readers, probably more than any other audience in history. But still very relevant to us. I mean, it is very much a matter of discipleship, teaching us that this opposition to Jesus really is there, and we have to learn to live with that, embrace it as part of our identity. So it very much has further discipleship value in that way. That, I think, is what we're going to learn from all these stories coming up in the last part of this fourth section. I think that's how Matthew advances his own purposes, and I think that's what we're going to learn from it. And I'm very eager to work through it because a lot of these stories here have a lot to them. So I'm really looking forward to it. I don't think there's a lot need here for a summary here at the end of this message. I mean, the whole message has been a summary in a sense. So I'll just let you know where we are going to start next time. We're starting at the very, very end of chapter 13, and it is the story of Jesus' return to Nazareth. Just to read it for you. When Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, that's Nazareth, he taught them there in the synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own town and in his own household." And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. That is a very good first story for especially the opposition theme coming up in the rest of this fourth section. But that is where we're starting next time, and that is what I'll be teaching on the next time I speak, which I'm not sure when I need to talk with Chad about the teaching schedule after today. But next time I teach, that's where we are. So again, I know this is just kind of one of those outlining messages just to get you prepped and ready for what's coming next. But if there are any questions or comments, we can hear those now.